Bob, we had a question come in from Ian. And this is a question that I'm interested to hear your answer, because I can honestly say I don't know what your answer to this is. Their question for us was, what are our favorite stories? One from each of us. What is your favorite story? What is my favorite story from the Hebrew Bible? So, Bob,
sure.
What would you say? Maybe, I mean, and people might immediately be saying, like, I think it's going to be Melchizedek as Bob's favorite story. And it might be.
Of course, yeah.
But what would you say is your favorite story? And
so
why?
I wrote a book on Melchizedek. I love Melchizedek all the way from my childhood. So Genesis 14, the references to Melchizedek, is there a reference to Melchizedek in Psalm 110? Obviously in the Epistle to the Hebrews. So I like Melchizedek, but the truth is, I really enjoy the story of the Rav Shake coming up and besieging Jerusalem, for Sennacherib. This is in 2 Kings 18, and it's parallel in Isaiah 36 through 39. I think it's a fascinating story. I think it's Christopher Seitz who wrote a book about this, Zion's Final Destiny, that I read when I was in grad school, that talks about, who copied who. Somebody obviously copied somebody because of the parallel story. We have this in the bird in a cage reference in the Annals of Sennacherib. So we have external corroboration of this. The story gets modified a little bit in the biblical text and the retelling of it. But I find this story fascinating. The things that the Masoretes do during that taunting scene where they're taunting him.
Flesh this story out a little bit for people that may not be so familiar with, this. What would you be your elevator pitch of what this story is?
No, the story is basically you're not supposed to rebel against Neo-Assyria, right? You're not supposed to rebel. You're supposed to be a good vassal. You're supposed to pay
Correct.
your dues. And of course,
be grateful.
And Israel and Samaria doesn't do that, and they come in and in 721 BCE, they wipe out Samaria, they wipe out Israel. This becomes the 10 lost tribes, right? But Judah is a faithful vassal. They come back in later. Hezekiah starts making all these preparations for rebellion. Then he decides apparently to rebel. The Bible says he rebelled against Assyria, and the Assyrians come in, and you get two stories stacked on top of each other back to back. The first story says that they come in and they take out Lachish, and Hezekiah goes to them, and he says, I've sinned. I've done wrong. Impose on me whatever penalty you want. I will pay it. Just please don't destroy Jerusalem. Please don't. And he imposes, silver, gold, give me your daughters for my wives, it's a heavy burden. And Hezekiah pays it. He strips the gold off the temple, off the doors, pays it, and Sennacherib goes away, right? The army goes away. And then it turns around and says, and then he comes back. So you get this second story, appears to be a second story, or is it an alternate version of the first story? But he's coming back. He puts Jerusalem under siege, and then you get this scene out of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right, where you get these guys taunting them, let us in, it's the French and the British, right, and they're taunting each other. Your mother smells of elderberries, and your father, what was it? They're doing this stuff.
Yeah,
and,
your mother's. Oh yeah,
I fart in your general direction, right?
Yes.
Your father was a hamster and your mother smelled of elderberries, whatever it is. I might have it backwards there, but they're taunting them from atop and that's what's going on in this thing. And he's basically saying, you should be terrified of us. We're gonna, and he says some pretty severe things to them. And on the top, this is Hezekiah's court. They're saying, no. Speak to us in Aramaic, because we speak Aramaic, but because you're frightening everybody else in here. They understand Hebrew.
We don't want them to hear you.
These guys are like, of course we're going to speak to you in Hebrew. We're trying to scare you. We want you to open up the gates. We want you to surrender, which I find fascinating. And then they have this line where, it's a siege. You're going to eat your own. And then the word there is a very dirty, literally a very dirty word. It's the all the Bibles, the English translations try to make it into filth. The Masoretes come along and do a corrective where they correct it. And they say, we know it says this, but we would really like it if you say, filth, and then it says, and you will drink and it's the word for urine. but the Masoretes come along and say, Meme regalayim. It's the waters at your feet.
The waters. Right. The Bible can't say you're going to eat feces and drink pee.
Right. No.
Except for when it does. Except for when
right. Although
you're
the King James, you drink your own piss type stuff. The King James sometimes comes through with a pretty accurate translation. So you've got this scene of them saying, "Look, we're going to kill you." And they're like, no, don't say that. You're going to scare the people. And that's like, we're trying to scare them. So you get this absurd taunting. And then they take the letter in, and then, Isaiah shows up and God sends the angel. And of course, none of this is recalled in Sennacherib's annals. In Sennacherib's annals, they get recalled because there's a civil war breaking out back in Nineveh, and they've got to go back and he dies. But I love this story because of the parallel, but because of this notion that Judah was a vassal, but Jerusalem survives. It had to pay him off. It got closed. It was besieged, but Jerusalem survives. And so I love that story. The other one that I really, really love, the story that I love to teach, is Genesis 38, is Judah and Tamar. I love telling this story because it's a story of a woman who was wronged. And she took power into her own hands. She took her own redemption into her own hands. And then she ended up showing up Judah himself, right? You have this great line, she is more righteous than I, because I would not give her my son. And I love walking students through that story and explaining levirate marriage, explaining how she was wronged and what she did to bring about her own redemption. So I love those two stories. What are yours?
I think if I had to pick one, and it feels like that kind of Sunday school story, but it's always been one of my favorites. The flood. I love, and especially because of the parallels, which we've talked about before, but being able to look into some of the corners within the flood narrative inside the Bible, and then some of those external flood accounts. The flood story has always been one of my favorites. While it has its own problems, it's not perfect. In some of the implications of it, it's not perfect, but as a part of this early origin story, connecting to creation, the moment where that verse of, does God regret God? The feeling of, I made this and now God's feelings towards this have very quickly changed, that it's a complicated description and portrayal between that so newly made humanity and the God that made them. But also when you start to do those parallels, I think one of my favorite details between, let's say, the Gilgamesh flood account and the biblical is just the little details, like the rudder on the craft or not, where Noah is in a rudderless craft. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh account, there is a rudder on the craft, which seems like a minor detail, a minor difference. But as far as how are they trying to frame themselves and their relationship to either nature or their deity, like, are you fighting against this? Are you fighting, or are you putting yourself into the hands of? And it comes from these small little moments that some people say you might be overreading things. You're reading too much into this moment. It's just a word. This is the ark. Does it have it? We don't know. And, depending on where you go to go see recreations of arcs potentially at different places, they'll have different approaches. But those little moments that I love is those insights for, well, who are the people behind these stories?
Right.
How do they see themselves? Because they're not always approaching things with the same kinds of questions, but within this idea of the flood account, how are they describing themselves and their relationship to their God? And in this background, that are they worried about this being history, or are they trying to tell some kind of greater story? That's, I think, one of my favorite stories is in there. Just the details that opens up for then looking at all these later moments. I think the flood has always been, and probably will always remain, one of my favorite stories to come back to. I also do, though, like the problematic side of it, that I think that gives a lot, and it feels like one of those great intro moments for people that are coming to the Bible, maybe from a historic position of faith, or you'd been in the church. And as you start to unpack some of these things, like the idea of sources in the Bible, or outside traditions, that the flood can be one of these stories that presents so many perspectives on that you can look at sources within the flood account, external sources, the development, that it's really, I feel like, a helpful story to start that conversation with the flood, because you can see so much of it just at one time. So as far as a teaching side, I think that story has a lot of value there to open the door to what do these things mean and how are we going to deal with this going forward from that story. And then I guess if I was to do a second, you picked Tamar. I love Yael and Sisera, the story of Deborah. Yeah. And I completely blame for this Cynthia Schaefer-Elliott, because this is a story that she teaches excellently within this story of, who is doing actions, and then the little details of like the household and the way food comes into this story. Right. And some of those, where is he sleeping and what's being implied by this and where does his head end up, and all of those elements that wrap into that's one of my favorite stories too. If we're picking both, one that's kind of on both sides of things, that's my second.
That's a fun one. Give me some milk to give me a little. One of the best memories burned into my head was when I was digging at Tel Azekah up. God, this was a decade ago. I was on a bus ride home, and I had been telling the story of Sisera, but I was trying to tell it in just Hebrew. I was trying to stick to the Hebrew that I knew, modern Hebrew, and so I had to use short, simple phrases of common words that I knew from modern Hebrew, and I was doing it in voices. So I was like, Sisera, Bolipo, I was doing stuff like this. And I had some people on the bus just rolling, because my vocabulary was so limited, and I was doing the voices, it was like lo, and I was like si sira, and it was just a fun story on a bus ride. This is in the morning on a dig site. If you're familiar, if you've ever gone on a dig,
early in the day,
you can get giddy, right? So this was something that was funny. It's burned in my head every time I tell the story. The fatigue
and the hours in the sun really do start to play tricks on your mind. And it's one of those moments where you're so exhausted that anything can suddenly become very humorous. And sometimes it really is. And then those little moments, we all know this, the little joke that becomes a joke that goes on for a long time.
Right.
That is one of my favorite stories